Thanks so much, Charlie and Meredith, for making this all possible for all of us. I'll keep this introduction brief just because I know we all want to hear lots from Joe, but it's a special privilege to introduce him because our paths have intersected so many times over the years. He grew up on the East Coast, not in an academic family, but his abilities were early recognized. And he found himself, and through his work, got into Oberlin College. And Oberlin College has not only provided him with a wonderful launching pad, but they've recognized him as one of their outstanding graduates in 2017. He was elected a fellow of the Council for the American Association of Advancement of Science and has many other awards and the like. But the big thing about Joe, after he went to University of Michigan to start graduate work. He graduated from Wayne State. But I think the marvelous thing about Joe is he does, in all four areas, he excels. He is a wonderful research scientist doing work on aging, a topic close to my heart, and evolution of aging. He's been a stalwart person advocating and advancing the field of evolutionary medicine from the very beginning. And with regards to today's topic, he has been the very first Black evolutionary biologist in the country. And he has expanded his focus to try to bring others into the fold and to try to help all of us to expand the diversity of our field and to see all of the value that is available to us if we actually do that. He's now the professor of biological sciences and the Joint School of Neurosciences and Nanoengineering at North Carolina, A&T State University, and UNC Greensboro. I'm just so looking forward to hearing from you, Joe. And this is just one more contribution to your education and outreach efforts, which add to your research and even your administration as the Associate Dean for Research at your university. Thanks so much for being with us, Joe.
Thank you, Randy. That was an amazing introduction. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen so that you can all see this. So are we good? Can everybody see the first slide?
Yep.
So what I'm going to talk to you about today is actually a book that I just completed with my colleague Alan Goodman called Everything You Wanted to Know About Race and Were Afraid to Ask. But for this presentation, we're going to add the introduction of why this is important for evolutionary medicine. So let's see if I can get this thing to work now. Yeah, there we go. So for those of you who don't know my scholarship in this area, I've written 2 books before the new one with Alan Goodman. And I began to think about why and how people thought racially in not only our society, but now worldwide, because I've had the opportunity to travel all around the world and talk to scholars in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the Far East. And racial thinking predominates amongst people who really should know better. And so in this first book, The Emperor's New Clothes, I provide the reader with a history of how people began to think this way. And it's also simultaneously a history of the development of biological thought, particularly of evolution, in conjunction with this specific problem, that is geographical variation and how we understand geographical variation. And then in the second book, The Race Myth, here I address the pathologies that continue to harm scholarship and practical work because people think racially. And in particular, both of these books have chapters on biomedical research and clinical practice. So in addition to this, as Professor Nessie has pointed out, I've done a lot of work to help popularize these ideas. And so I list some resources here that you can use. I want to point to the documentary film, Race, Power of an Illusion, in which I play a large role in the first chapter on Are We So Different? This piece is probably the best documentary that's ever been produced on this topic, but it is now somewhat dated as we filmed this before most of the genomic work on human biological variation that took place over the last 2 decades. And there is talk with California Newsreel to redo this film and to update it. And finally, I also like to point out the Encyclopedia of Race and Racism. The second edition is much, much better than the first, not just because I was the lead editor for all of the evolution, genetics, and anthropology entries, but because it was really much better organized and much more in depth than the first version. Okay, so here we go. Now, I started thinking seriously about race in medicine right around the turn of the millennium. So I list here a bunch of my papers on the subject. I started thinking about the question of evolution and racial ideas in medicine in this paper, Scylla and Charybdis, which appears at the top. And I think I came to probably my most powerful exposition of these ideas in the 2011 piece, Evolutionary versus Racial Medicine, Why It Matters, and also hence the title of today's talk. Now, interestingly enough, and this sort of shows, I think it's a sad episode in our history, is that I wrote, why the non-existence of biological races does not mean the non-existence of racism in 2015. But after George Floyd was choked out on television, on video, that day, my Twitter feed began exploding with people talking about reading this paper for the first time. So it sort of took a glaring example of racial injustice for people to start thinking, or some people to start thinking seriously about these issues. And all of a sudden people were reading stuff that I wrote 2 decades ago. So hopefully we won't have this problem with the new book. All right, so my co-author is Dr. Alan Goodman. He's a professor of biological anthropology. He has several affiliations. He's taught at Hampshire College for 35 years, and he's a past president of the American Anthropological Association. And not attempting to campaign, but I wanted the audience to know that I am on the ballot this year to be president of the Society for the Study of Evolution. And I just thought I'd make you aware of that fact. And so when this book comes out, possibly we'll have 2 presidents of prominent associations as their lead authors. So the purpose of everything you wanted to know about race was to provide people with concise and accessible answers to the questions about race and racism. Now, these questions were gleaned from conversations over the last 20 years with students, educators, policymakers, friends, families, biomedical scientists. We've done work to show that virtually everyone, including, as I said, professionals who should know better, operate under a series of rather serious racial fallacies. In fact, in a paper that I was on in 2018 with colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill and at Duke University, we did a large survey of over 3,000 adults on a number of aspects having to do with genetic essentialism and ideas about race, and they were rife throughout the 3,000 responses that we got. So we constructed this book for people who really want to work towards human equity. So I don't really expect, people who are quite comfortable with white supremacy in the way our societies work today to read this book or to in any way agree with what we say. But there are a lot of people, again, over the course of my career, I've come in contact with a lot of people who really do want to do something about the situation, but they don't have the tools to speak about it effectively. And that's really what we wanted to do in this book. The title pays homage to David Rubin's famous book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex, But Were Afraid to Ask, published in 1972. But unlike Rubin's book, Rubin's book does a really good job of discussing, important day-to-day things, and he threw in a great deal of humor to make the text more accessible to the reader. When you read our book, and I hope you do, there's no comedy in it. There is no way that we could talk about these subjects and include levity, because things are just too serious. So quickly, I'm going to tell you about the table of contents. First, we go through what is race, racism, and human biological variation. I am not going to do this in today's talk because, as you can see from 2 books and numerous papers, I've done this many, many times. So if you need to understand why our species, anatomically modern humans, doesn't really have biological races, then please read that literature. But that's not going to be the conversation today. And so the second chapter is, how did race come to be and why is it still so important? The third chapter, everything you wanted to know about genetics and race, again, is taking what we did in chapter 1 and giving it much more detail. Chapter 4 is an examination of racism itself. Now, many of you are familiar with, the classic biologic racism that sort of posits that there are these innate, genetically determined differences between groups that are defined as biological races. However, most people are not aware that the way racism operates in the 21st century really isn't driven by biologic racism. It's actually more what scholars and sociologists call aversive or colorblind racism, in which the primary idea is that, well, society is no longer racist, so whatever happens within that society is really the result of these anonymous forces that treat individuals as if they are the same. And we address that fallacy in chapter 4. Now, the chapters that are going to be of most interest to this audience are chapter 5, why do races differ in disease incidence. Again, I'm going to remind you that this is a title because both Alan and I actually don't think that human beings have biological races. Chapter 6, life history, aging, and mortality. And then chapter 7, athletics, bodies, and abilities, which is, again, will be of interest to this group. But chapter 8, races, brains, and behaviors, will probably be more interesting. Chapter 9, driving while black. Chapter 10, DNA and ancestry testing, and I will talk about some of that in today's conversation. Chapter 11, race names and race mixing. And chapter 12, we present our vision of a world without racism. So, chapter 5, we address these specific questions because they're ones that we've encountered over and over again throughout our careers. So people ask us, at my doctor's office, intake form, they ask about age, sex, and race. Why do they ask about race? When doctors and epidemiologists and other medical scientists say race is a risk factor, what do they mean? Are there race-specific diseases? Does blood differ by race? Can I donate or receive a blood transfusion or an organ from a person of another race? Are certain medicines more effective depending upon your race? And should a pill be colorblind? In the United States, races differ in the rates of the most complex diseases, such as diabetes, high blood pressure, congestive heart failure, blah, blah, blah. What explains these differences if the genetic differences are so minimal? Finally, why are results from bone density tests race specific? Now, there are a lot of other questions that clearly could have been included in this chapter, but we chose these simply because these are the ones that we encountered the most. Now, before I begin my discussion of the biological issues, I wish to give you some context with regard to the experience of persons of African descent in the United States. Now, I'm a big fan of turning things into either calendar years or 24-hour clocks. So what you see here are events turned into 24-hour clock time. So we start with the first Africans in Jamestown, Virginia. Now this is of course referring to the English colonies because there are actually persons of African descent in the Spanish Southwest probably 70 years before they appeared in Jamestown, Virginia. But by 4:51 a.m., laws appear differentiating Africans from other servants. At 1:50 p.m. in the afternoon, we have the Fugitive Slave Act. At 2:43, the 13th Amendment ends slavery. But an hour later, we have Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. At 3:57 p.m., the second Morrill Land Grant Act founds the historically Black college and university land grant institutions, of which my primary appointment is at one of them. Most people don't know that there were two Morrill Land Grant Acts. The first, which founded schools like North Carolina State and Michigan State, et cetera. And the second, because of racial segregation in the former Confederate states, was necessary because persons of African descent could not attend those institutions. At 5:57, we have a wave of race riots and massacres of African Americans across the United States. This was called Red Summer. The Tulsa massacre occurs 2 years later. It's actually been presented dramatically in the HBO series, The Watchmen. And actually they did a very good job of representing what happened during that massacre, including white supremacists using airplanes to bomb African-American houses and villages. At 7:27 p.m., the Society for the Study of Evolution was founded. Now, my examination into the historical documents says that there was no one there who was a person of African descent. There was no one there who would have been from what we would consider today a minority serving institution or historically Black institution in the United States. Now, at 7:49 p.m., the mass incarceration ratio in the United States is 4-to-1, meaning that for each person of European descent imprisoned, 4 African Americans are imprisoned. At 8:07 p.m., Emmett Till is lynched. Now that signifies the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. It's also the same year that I was born. And if you ask me the question, do I remember whites only water fountains and signs? Of course I do, because I experienced them all throughout my youth. Okay, in 8:25 p.m., mass incarceration has now reached 5-to-1. At 8:29, the Civil Rights Act is passed. And by the way, this is the second Civil Rights Act. Most people do not know that there were a series of civil rights and voting acts that were passed right after the Civil War ended, in the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. But none of these acts were ever enforced in the South. So the second Voting Rights Act is passed at 8:42 p.m. At 9:01, the mass incarceration ratio is now 6-to-1. At 10:03, I became the first African American and probably the first person of African descent in the world to earn a PhD in evolutionary biology. Now, there was an individual Dalton Dexko at the University of Texas who did an evolution-related thesis in '62, but he was more a fish guy and he never really participated in any evolution society. So I still claim the honor of being the first African American in evolutionary biology. But that same year, George Bush runs his infamous Willie Horton ads on television. At 10:04, the mass incarceration ratio is now 7-to-1. 11:12, Barack Obama is elected president, becoming the first person who was not fully of European descent. Because I would like to remind you that his mother was a European American and his father was a Kenyan. And by the way, there were no Kenyans in the transatlantic slave trade. So Barack Obama is more closely related to Dick Cheney than he is to me. At 11:34, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and Michael Brown are all killed. At 11:59, the moment we're currently in, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Jacob Blake. The net worth of a white family in the United States is $171,000 versus $17,500 for a black family. So it's in this context that we need to understand this word and concept of race. Now, the claim that race is not a scientific concept is a platitude that is mouthed, constantly in the humanities and social sciences. I have been misquoted by numerous venues, New York Times, LA Times, etc., all saying that, Graves said there's no such thing as race. I've never once said that, okay? What I have consistently said is that our species, anatomically modern humans, does not have biological races. And there is a clear difference between the biological race concept, and despite its many problems, which again, if you want to discuss that, that's another seminar, but there is a biological race concept, and that biological race concept has evolved with biology and with evolutionary thought, beginning with morphology or phenotype, and then based upon geographical location of individuals. With the coming of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, it morphs to population-based around the frequency of genes within and between populations. And finally, with the coming of phylogenetic methods, the idea of cladistic races being those groups that can show or can have a unique evolutionary lineage shown by phylogenetic methods. This is very different from the socially constructed or defined race, which operates in medicine and biomedical research. Now, this category arbitrarily utilizes aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion. In fact, anything that you want to throw in the mix can and has been used to define people as socially constructed races. But the thing that has to be made clear about these socially defined races is they exist for no other purpose than social dominance hierarchy. So in other words, these are not biomedical tools. They're not taxonomical methods or the result of taxonomical methods. They're really and have always been associated with determining who has opportunity and who has rights in given societies. And as such, these socially defined races are historically and culturally contextual. So in other words, what counts as being Black in Brazil is not what counts as being Black in Puerto Rico, is not what counts as being Black in the continental United States, is not what counts as being Black in the UK. In fact, I once spoke in Brixton, and this was during the Brixton rebellions. I was in a bar after my talk, and a bunch of persons who were clearly of East Asian descent came into the bar, and they were wearing dreads, and they sat down with me and they welcomed me as another Black brother. And I was really confused at the time. But in their society, being East Asian was part of the Black culture. And so I learned something. Didn't know that about the UK. So now, quickly, to make the point about the non-existence of biological races, I use this quote from Ernst Mayr, which really sort of rings true, where he says, the concept of subspecies is fallacious. Now, this also means geographical race. So he says, concept of subspecies is fallacious. Species are not composites of uniform subtypes or subspecies, but consist of an almost infinite number of local populations, each in turn in sexual species consisting of genetically different individuals. The difficulties of the subspecies concept are intensified if one considers the subspecies not merely as a practical device of the taxonomist, but also as a unit of evolution. The better the geographical variation of the species is known, the more difficult it becomes to delineate subspecies, and the more obvious it becomes that many such delineations are quite arbitrary. And that's pretty much been my point the entire time, that there's a number of ways to look at the geographical variation in humans. And you can come up with all the schemes you want. And at the end of the day, all of them are arbitrary. And so if they're all arbitrary, I then say, well, then none of them are meaningful. Now, to give you a sense of how medicine has progressed with persons of African descent. Again, I'm just going to give you some quick history. But one of the things is that few people realize that the founding of medicine in America was facilitated by the ease of access to enslaved bodies. And there are a number of historical accounts of this. One of them, for example, Dr. Joseph Lewis, who peeled the skin from the body of a deceased black man named Cato, boils a corpse in a kettle to free the skeleton for study. Cato's skin was tanned, and Lewis used it to dress his instrument case. So this was typical of how enslaved people and their bodies were treated at this time. Now, in the 19th century, this is a period, and again, if you read my first book, in which polygenism, the idea that human beings were descended from separate Adam and Eves, or usually they call the pre-Adamite race theory. And another point that I make for people who don't really have a great understanding of the history of biology is that folks need to understand that biology rested on creationist foundations until the publication of The Origin of Species. And even then, it took a while for evolutionary ideas to predominate the way biologists thought. But certainly with regard to this notion of race, it was dominated by creationist thought well into the 19th century. And in fact, in our surveys of Americans and how they think about race, the vast majority of Americans still accept special creationists. Yeah, is that someone asking a question, or is that just someone who's not muted? Okay, I guess that's just someone who's not muted. So, still the majority of Americans accept special creationist foundations for their racial beliefs. So, in general, at the beginning of the 19th century, physicians thought that Africans and Europeans generally suffered from the same diseases and disabilities. However, they did think that there were some that were unique to Africans. For example, William Harvey and John Lindsay characterized a disease called cachexia africana, or dirt eating, which was associated with emotional distress and depression. P. Tiedemann in 1826 thought that the darker skin of Africans allowed them to withstand heat and humid conditions better than Europeans, and he certainly was right about that. Now, Samuel Cartwright, who was a South Carolina physician and who thought it was his mission to demonstrate medically the inferiority of the African, defined Negro consumption in 1850 as being different from white consumption. In 1850, he also defined the disease drapetomania, which was the irrational desire of Negroes to run away. And in 1850, he also defined dysthesia, which was a disease that caused slaves to perform tasks in a haphazard manner. Now, this kind of thinking translated into the 21st century. Okay, Sally Seitel, in a New York Times op-ed, wrote that she was a racially profiling doctor. She said, "In practicing medicine, I am not colorblind. I always take note of my patient's race. So do many of my colleagues. We do it because certain diseases and treatment responses cluster by ethnicity." Now, there's a reason why I bolded race and ethnicity in this exchange, and that's because this is typical of people who haven't given a great deal of thought to the meaning of the term race, that she's immediately conflating biological race. In other words, if you're thinking about these disease predispositions, really thinking about it more biologically, but then she's conflating it with a social science term, ethnicity, which has to do really with the country of origin and language and culture of people. So these things are not the same at all. Now, in 2016, paper appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it was published out of the University of Virginia's medical school. And it dealt with false racial beliefs held by medical students at that institution. Now, you can see some of them, such as blacks age more slowly than whites. Now, the responses here are percentages of first year, second year, third year, and residents at the UVA medical school. So you can see that for their medical students, the percentage of people believing this false idea declines over the 3 years of medical training. Now, the residents, by the way, of course, as you realize, are people that came from other medical schools. And so, you know, their UVA's curriculum would have had no impact on them. Black nerve endings are less sensitive than whites. By the way, this is a view from the 19th century. And first, second year students, some of them had this idea. It's gone pretty much by the third year. Black blood coagulates more quickly than whites. Almost half of the incoming medical students believe this. And again, this was reduced significantly by the third year. Black skin is thicker than white. Again, over 60% of incoming medical students believe this. By the third year, it's still well over a third. Residents, of course, 100% of them believe that. Blacks have stronger immune systems than whites. Again, I find this one hard to believe that anybody would think this, considering the differential history of infectious disease for persons of African descent in the United States, but 33 third, but again, by the third year, it's significantly diminished. So who are these blacks? And this is something that, again, most people don't truly appreciate. The people that we call African Americans are a product of the historical period of the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow in the United States. This population didn't exist before the coming of the transatlantic slave trade. And so using modern genomic tools, Burke et al. Used about 950 SNPs to determine the percentage of African ancestry in persons who self-identified as African Americans. And what you note in this figure is that the mean percentage of African descent goes down as you move away from the southeastern United States. So in fact, in Washington state, the percentage of African ancestry in people who socially define as African American is close to 50% African and 50% European. So if you were treating, say, African Americans in South Carolina and African Americans in Washington state as if they were had the same genomic background, you'd be making a huge mistake. Now, in a paper that I actually commented on a few months ago, 23andMe used their tools to determine the origins of persons of African descent in West and Central Africa. And what you see here is that in the United States, most of the populations in the United States show a very high amount of Nigerian ancestry based upon the 23andMe panels, but that's somewhat different from the way people are in South America. For example, if you look at Brazil, most of those people show Congolese descent as opposed to Brazilian. As opposed to Nigerian. And of course, it makes perfect sense based upon the latitude of the Congo and the latitude of Brazil. Similarly, if we look at people who are defined as Latino or Hispanic, we see even greater difficulties because this population was produced by admixture from three groups: African, Amerindian or Native American and European. And these percentages differ widely depending upon which portion of the country of the United States you're looking at and which portion of the Caribbean you're looking at. So for example, the next slide, we see the genetic ancestry of Latin American populations with red counting for Amerindian, orange, European, and blue for Sub-Saharan African. And these percentages differ between Puerto Rico, Mexico, Colombia, and Peru. But an even stronger example is given in this next slide, okay, in which if we go to Venezuela, to Colombia, and we look at the two neighboring states of Medellin and Choco, you see that the population genetic ancestry differs radically. So, and this, of course, depends upon the history of the region and particularly the transportation of enslaved people into that region. So people in Medellin have strong percentages of Native American or Amerindian ancestry, okay, larger amounts of European ancestry, and much smaller amounts of African ancestry. But in Choco, which is the neighboring state, people have far larger ancestry, African ancestry, much smaller European ancestry, and again, significant Amerindian ancestry. So the people in Choco are similar in terms of their genetic percentages to African Americans. Again, indicating that this term Hispanic, in terms of its biomedical significance, is compromised. So now, however, on the other hand, when we look at people of European ancestry or European Americans, we see that the vast majority of their ancestry is European. Now, the history of that is very clear in terms of the practice of hypodescent, in which in the United States, any detectable African or Amerindian ancestry classified you as either African or Indian. So in that way, anyone with that ancestry was removed from the European or white population. And hence, that's why their ancestry tends to be strongly European. Now, 23andMe uses the category British Irish and Scandinavian, and there are a couple of other subcategories of Europeans. But what happens is that, again, when we look at the mean percentage of Scandinavians and the mean percentage of British and Irish, it differs by where in the country you live. Now, as you probably all have heard by now, the President of the United States was in Bemini, Minnesota, talking about the good genes of the people in the crowd. And of course, what he meant by that was their Scandinavian ancestry. And he then pointed to, in earlier statements, his own German ancestry as being the reason he's so successful.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah, 5 minutes?
Yep, 5 minutes.
Okay, well, I'm about where I wanted to be. So quickly, okay, when we think about disease risk, okay, there are three factors that determine one's disease risk: genes, environment, and chance. And when we think about the diseases that make up the substance of health disparity, these are mainly governed by quantitative genetics. And I've placed, the classic quantitative genetic equation here and the calculation of heritability from that equation. And since I have 5 minutes, I'm not going to do a whole lot of description of the various aspects. But one of the things we've seen across US history are differential mortality of persons of African descent at ratios between 2 to 2.5 across age category. And then this has been historically stable for when data was available. So these data go from 1963 to 2004. Okay, if we look at specific diseases such as cancer and heart disease, we see similar ratios across age category. But what most people fail to do is to look at environmental sources that would be contributing to that. So for example, if we look at the mortality ratio by household income, you see that people with the lowest household incomes have mortality ratios of 3, 2.49, which are very similar, by the way, to the mortality ratios we see when we do a black-white characterization. And again, I started this conversation with the net worth of African American families at about 17,000. So if this were just due to poverty, African Americans fall exactly where they should fall with regard to mortality ratio risk. Now, we've also looked at the heritability of lifespan for various groups in the United States. And as you can see, the heritability of lifespan in European Americans is 0.3. In Caribbean Hispanics and African Americans, it's considerably lower. And one point that I want to make in a series of studies that I've placed in the slide at the bottom are studies that show that the mortality profiles and disease risk profiles of Western Africans are drastically different from those of African Americans. But within one generation, when those people come to the United States, they take on the mortality and disease profiles of African Americans. So this again strongly indicates that this isn't genetic predisposition for disease. It's more the environmental influences of living in a racially subordinated society that produce these mortality profiles. Now, finally, I think if I can get this one last slide in, yeah, this is the one I wanted to show. So if we were going to just make, the standard hypothesis of who should be sicker, who should have a greater burden of quantitative disease, it turns out that it should be Europeans, not Africans. So when you look at, and again, Lomo and I'll look at a whole genome scan of Africans and Europeans and look for substitutions that were homozygous that probably were bad, or okay, PO stands for possibly bad, and there was no statistical difference between Africans and Europeans for possibly bad genes, but for probably bad homozygosity, Europeans had a significantly higher burden of deleterious genetic variation than Africans do. And if that's true, we would expect Europeans to have higher prevalence of heart disease, cancer, and other complex disease than Africans do, which leaves us with the question of if, in fact, we actually wanted to study the genomic causality of health disparity, how would we do that, given that the environments of African Americans and European Americans have never been equalized? So in this paper that I just published, where I propose a hypothetical experimental design, we could use the classical transplant experiment. And we could take the African Americans and put them in the environment enjoyed by European Americans, in which you are socially dominant, you have legal protections, you have cultural hegemony, you have less exposure to environmental toxins, you have a police force that protects and serves, you have greater food availability and diversity, and then take Europeans and put them in the African American environment where they would be socially subordinated, okay? They would have mass incarceration, they would be a numerical minority, they would have differential exposure to lead, organochlorides, and food deserts. And then if these populations still maintained their disease profiles with this transplant experiment, then I would actually believe that there's a genomic basis to health disparity. But of course, this is an experiment that will never be done for a number of reasons, because, and in the book, we talk about the fact that we actually would like to see both groups placed in permissive environments and then see what happens, as opposed to transplanting them. So anyway, I promised I would stop here. And so I'm going to just stop, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. That was great. Thank you very much. We have some great comments in the chat box. Would anybody like to ask a question or raise any of the points that are in the chat box?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm trying to find it, sorry. So I understand that a lot of information, such as what you presented, is critical to acknowledge when it comes to understanding the treatment of Black and brown bodies in America. But such information is not openly taught in medical schools, nor like the high school I go to. So I was just curious, what steps do you feel should be taken to increase awareness within academic institutions in the medical field?
Well, one of the things I worked with Dr. Nessie when we were at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center was trying to get more evolutionary content into the medical school curriculum. And in a paper that I published in 2016 on, using evolutionary thinking to spur greater critical thinking in medical training, we talked about a series of competencies that we would like to see introduced in medical training. And that included an understanding of biological and social definitions of race and health disparity. So at the end of the day, you're absolutely right that this material isn't taught. It's not taught at the undergraduate level. It's not taught in graduate school. It's not taught in medical school. And hence, the reason why we have so many people who are essentially genetic determinists and have these, archaic views of human biological diversity. And we are, one of the things that I would like to see, this international society do more of is make tools available to help people incorporate this into their curriculum.
Great, thank you for that. Looks like we have a question from Jillian Bentley. Jillian, you can go ahead with your question.
Sorry, just unmuting everything. Yeah, Joe, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. I wanted to ask a question because an article came out yesterday in Nature and got some attention in the British press about how susceptibility to COVID-19 apparently aligns with a small segment of genes that are associated with Neanderthal ancestry, but the article pointed out that 60% of Bangladeshis happen to have this gene, apparently. So I just wondered, that raises a red flag for me. I have to confess I haven't read the article yet because it just came out yesterday, but when people make these statements, and because I think a lot of the public out there would tend to still associate Neanderthals with something brutish in our past, is it dangerous to write an article like this? And how should we interpret this when people link, gene segments to susceptibility to diseases and seem to imply that they're wholly genetic?
What I'm doing right now is typing the name of a piece that I wrote for Science for the People magazine online called Their Money, Our Lives, in which I dealt with this whole Neanderthal genetic variant idea. The first thing is that when we look genome-wide at markers that would make someone susceptible for any sort of viral infection, it turns out that there really is no evidence that any human population has variants that make them more susceptible to COVID or more resistant to COVID. So there's also the, I think Ellingworth's paper about the Neanderthal segment. And, that was in a cohort of Spanish and Italians. And it didn't say that the variant made you more susceptible to being infected with COVID. It meant that you were more susceptible to having, adverse symptoms because of COVID infection. But in the United States, the situation that we dealt with was, questions of exposure. So people who had what were called essential jobs were more likely to be at work and more likely to be exposed to people carrying COVID 2019. In addition, communities where you don't have the ability to social distance means that you're more likely to run into people who had COVID-19. If you have to travel to work by mass transportation, you're more likely to come into contact. So there's so many environmental determinants increasing your probability that you're going to be, impacted by COVID, that you don't really need to look for specific genomic variants that are giving you more probability. And then in addition to that, as far as I know, no one has actually determined what percentage of the variants of the disease condition or of, your risk of the disease is determined by these variants. So, we had a speaker a few weeks ago who talked about genomic variants associated with, preterm birth. And then I asked the question, well, of your SNPs that are significant, what percentage of the variants in the phenotype do they explain? And the answer is 1%. So my guess is if this variant is found at higher frequency in Bangladeshis, it's probably explaining 1% of the variants in their prevalence and or disease course, until somebody shows me otherwise.
Great,
and I agree with you that kind of analysis is extremely dangerous.
Thanks.
Hey Joe, there's some questions in the chat box about your book and when it's going to be published and how people can get a copy of it.
Well, it's going to be published by Columbia University Press. Publication date is September 2021. Now we pushed the editors to try to get it out sooner, but it's the best they can do. If anyone wants excerpts or things, you can talk to me about it. And we've been, for example, releasing parts, as part of free publicity for this. So just contact me and I'll see what I can do.
Great, thank you. So we have some questions, some raised hands, but in the chat box, there's a lot of questions about what do we do? And a lot of people are mentioning that your slide on anti-racism in academia looks super useful, and wondering if you could quickly go over that.
Okay, so yeah, that's actually from another presentation.
Oh.
But, yeah. So where's the anti-racism slide? Let me see if I can.
It must have popped its head up at the
must have
end.
popped up somewhere at the end. So, okay, questions. Anti-racism in the academy. So yeah, let me quickly share that slide again if I can. Yeah.
And Joe, there have also been some questions about whether these slides could be made available. Would you be willing?
Charlie, for you, yeah, you're my man, dude. If you want them, you got them. Now, if Meredith had asked, we'd be in trouble, because I said, no way, Meredith, I'm not giving you these slides. But since Charlie asked, yeah, I'll totally give them to him. So anyway, this is actually taken from an essay I wrote called "Science in the Belly of the Beast," and I'll, again, I'll send the reference to that piece to the organizers. But this really comes down to, it was an essay that was written for particularly young URM academicians, as well as women who are entering careers in the academy. And the first thing you have to ask yourself when you go into the academy is, what are your goals? Why are you there? And for many of us scientists, we're there because we want to do good science. And that's great, because everything else flows from doing good science. But then the question is, well, what is your science for? And that's where I talk about something I call the enterprise of science. And we'll also send a link out to people at this presentation, because I'm on a AAAS panel on October 14th, where I'm going to talk about the enterprise of science in more detail. But at the end of the day, the enterprise of science is, what are the applications of the science you're doing? Who does it benefit? Who gets value from the work you do? And so you have to ask yourself, if I'm going to participate in this enterprise of science, and I'm going to be in an academic institution, how can I work within that institution? And then what are the most appropriate strategies to achieve those goals? And the reason I call this Science in the Belly of the Beast is that, at least for me, what I found is that my goals were diametrically opposed to that of the institution. While all of these institutions have diversity inclusion statements, virtually none of them mean it. And so if you're going to work to make your science inclusive, you make the science you do impact more people and do it in ways that don't leave people out, then you need to have a strategy to make that happen. So I'll just give you one example of that. While I was at a Research One university in the West that shall remain nameless, I got into a major dispute with J. Philippe Rushton. And for those of you that don't know Rushton, because he passed away a few years ago, he was the president of the Pioneer Fund. The Pioneer Fund was founded by a Nazi sympathizer, Wycliffe Draper, in the 1930s. They still fund most of the race and IQ and race and educational attainment research that you see. And in my dispute with Rustin, I demonstrated that in his book, he had taken materials from a peer-reviewed journal article, and he had misrepresented what the authors had published in their paper. He had transformed them and put them in a table without giving an original attribution, and he had not explained why he did that statistical transformation. And of course, the statistical transformation was supporting his hypothesis. So I pointed all this out, and I also said that, you know, his work is racist. So I get this letter from the Pioneer Fund threatening to sue me for libel. I went to my university and I asked them, would they defend me? And the university said, well, you're on your own. So, okay, if you want to do this work, you need to have strategies, and I'll talk about what those strategies will be in my October 14th seminar, and you can read about them in the entire essay, Science and the Belly of the Beast. Okay, so any more questions that I can address?
Great, thank you for that. So I know we're running short on time, but feel free to leave if you need to, but we'll take a couple more questions. It looks like we had a question from Margaret Humphreys. Margaret, do you still have your question? Oh, I think she may have had to leave. So we'll go to Randy Nessie for a question then. Randy, go ahead with your question.
I was going to ask a question about what percentage of genetic variation we lost when leaving Africa, but that's for another time. I'm so impressed with what we need to do, Joe. You and I worked together to try to find ways of getting more under-recognized minority students to our meeting for the ISEMP meeting. And we didn't do very well, even though we managed to raise enough money to get them there for free. I don't think there's much time to talk about it now, but I hope that you'll work with a lot of us to figure out better strategies to get people in. And I think your article, I hope everybody reads that article. It talks very thoughtfully about, you know, the many different reasons why we have such bad underrepresentation and some practical strategies for doing something about it. I think one of the most important ones is to have really good evolutionary scientists out there working like you. And I hope lots of people, you beat me to it before, will vote for you. Since many people here I know are members of the Society for the Study of Evolution, it would be just wonderful for you to lead that organization and move it forward while sticking with ISEMF as well and helping us too. Thanks so much, Joe.
Well, yeah, that's a lot, Randy. And certainly one of the things that I had pledged to do if I become president of SSE is to work more closely with aligned societies such as ISEMP, ESA, Ecological Society of America. And since Meredith is now a fellow of the Entomological Society of America, I think we'll try to work closely with them as well. Any other questions before we have to end this session?
I think Charlie will wrap it up.
Yeah, I think we're going to wrap up. We're at the top of the hour, so we got to wrap up. This was fantastic, Joe. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, your science, and so much else, and all of these great resources. The video will be made available. You heard we'll also hopefully get the slides and make those available. And we're all looking forward to your book when it comes out, Joe.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you. And let me just share with you quickly before we go the upcoming Club EvMeds. Hopefully you're seeing my screen here. Here was today's. Next week we have Eleanor Carlson talking about assessing SARS-CoV-2 susceptibility, a paper that has just come out. That should be a great talk. And then after that we have Brian Hare, who will be talking about his book, Survival of the Friendliest. And you can go to our website and scroll down and see all of the other talks that we have coming up. And we're already very actively planning for early 2021. So thank you guys for coming and taking part. And we look forward to seeing you next week and future weeks. Thanks very much. And thanks, Meredith.